or there are other things that sometimes are more attractive, or in many cases, as was mentioned on the previous panel, they aren't necessarily aware of what they're giving away as they proceed through life. So I'm interested in your talking about a contradiction that you must see every day in your work, that there is at the level of principle and abstraction, privacy matters utterly to Americans, and at the level of sort of daily life, there are ways in which they don't necessarily follow that value. And how do you navigate in that environment to make sure that they sort of get what they want, even though they don't necessarily know exactly how they want it?
Right. Well, Lee, I think you're right. People place a high value on privacy in lots and lots of different ways. I think the challenge that people face today is that they're constantly being coerced to give up their data, to rethink their decisions about withholding data, to make information available that they probably wouldn't otherwise make available because of some opportunity that's presented to them. And when I first noticed this a long time ago, I've been at this for a while, and I thought, well, what analogies do we have for this? I mean, how do we understand people's innate understanding that they want to be able to control their data, and at the same time they're constantly faced with these decisions? And I said, well, you look at some of the big sort of regulatory challenges of our modern industrial society, auto safety, our food safety. Consumers in the early days were often in very similar situations. I mean, cars were really dangerous. I mean, they're still dangerous, but they were really dangerous. And people sort of knew, I guess at some level, in the 40s and 50s, you'd buy a car, it was cool, it would go fast, but of course there were no safety features, they were poorly maintained, accidents were fatal. And for a long time, people just had this sense about it, well, they're cool, and, there's a risk with driving, you kind of get used to it. And at a certain point, I think what began to happen in the conscience of American consumers is they thought to themselves, hold it, shouldn't I be able to, drive a car, use a product, get its benefit, and not face all these risks, right? In other words, how do we provide the benefits of new technology to consumers without exposing them to unnecessary risk? And then you look in the auto safety field and you see all sorts of things started to change. Cars were built better, maintenance was better, safety features were adopted. But here was the key insight, and I think it was really Ralph Nader who helped people understand this. At the end of the day, it wasn't going to be the driver going to more auto safety schools that was going to make the driving experience safer, right? It wasn't going to be the driver who was told, if you're about to have an accident and someone's in the front seat, you need to swing your arm out and protect that person, taking your hand off the steering wheel to prevent them from flying through the windshield, right? This is actually how auto manufacturers before Congress in the 1960s explained safety practices for driving a car. You should do this if you're approaching an accident. And everyone nodded because that's what they had been taught. The key insight was to say it's not reasonable to place this burden on the driver. The burden has to be on the manufacturers. It has to be through regulation. And I think that's the big shift that we're going to see on the internet privacy front. At some point, people are going to say, whether it's Facebook settings or Google Buzz or something else, they're going to say, it's just not reasonable for people, to have to spend all this time trying to refigure out what their privacy settings were. Someone else is going to have to step in and say to these companies, people should be able to go online, use these cool services, and not have to spend so much time worrying about their privacy.
That gets to another thing that has changed, at least in my thinking since that earliest survey about privacy, which is that when I looked at the data and saw how important it was as something Americans cherish as a value, I anticipated that at some point there would be a series of steps, maybe like the sort of rising incidence of mayhem with cars, that there would be something equivalent to that in the data sphere, that there would be a data spill, there would be abuses of data that would so stir up people that they would change the way that they approach this stuff, that they might not necessarily know how to set their privacy settings or manage their identities in good ways, but at least they'd be mad about it. And the data, and yet we've gone through a series of data spills themselves, a series of technology changes that people were not happy about, and yet they aren't really rising up at the level of irritation and grievance that you might think, given how highly they hold privacy as a value. So I'm wondering about the political atmosphere of this. Do you see things coalescing now in ways that they haven't in years before?
I think we actually are seeing people speaking out more, and for me, it's particularly encouraging to see a lot of young people, getting more active on privacy issues. And I think about the creation of the Facebook group, Facebook Users Against the New Terms of Service, right? This was a little over a year ago, and there were more than 100,000 people that signed up for that Facebook group because they were unhappy about the change in the terms of service. And Facebook got the message, and they pulled back their plans. They created a new public process. They did some things actually at the time that I thought were great. I said some very favorable things about how Facebook responded when users spoke out. I have a somewhat different view today. But it was really interesting to watch. Same thing with Google Buzz. I mean, Google, which is a company, it's extraordinarily good, I think, at rolling out new products. I mean, they do it, maybe Apple does it as well, maybe a little better, but it's kind of neck and neck, and everyone else is far behind. But when Google decided to introduce Buzz based on the Gmail account, and Gmail users suddenly said, wow, there's my contact information, the people I email most, publicly available. How did that happen? There was enormous pushback. Now, I think what we're going to need to see as sort of the next step in this maturing of the privacy debate will be for people to make the connection between this level, well articulated of public concern, and some real legal protections, some real action by Congress, so that we don't have to keep going through this. But the fact that it's happening still, the fact that we're seeing protest, I think is good.
So then I should ask you the elevator question that you put to the other panel. If you had a minute with President Obama and the Hertz line, what would your single most important policy change be?
Well, I think the main thing I would say is, privacy is a very important long-term interest. And there's a real risk right now in Washington. People are constantly trading privacy off for other things, national security, government access, in some context innovation, although I think that's a little misunderstood. But if you really lose privacy, it's going to be very hard to recapture. And to me, actually, the issue starts to look a lot like environmental protection. When you actually confront the problems of unsafe water or air you can't really breathe, it is very hard to start to undo that. And I think we may, at some point face that kind of problem if there isn't more aggressive defense of privacy.
So would there be a framework then that you would apply to what the policy should be?
I would say we need to start enforcing legal rights of privacy. That's the main thing. A lot of, the United States is a funny country when it comes to privacy. We actually created many of the original privacy laws that were adopted in countries around the world. Europe has this big privacy directive, but it largely follows from laws that were in the United States 20 years ago. Now, we moved away from that, and we began to rely more on self-regulatory approaches, and we did a little bit less government oversight, and then we ended up with things like the Patriot Act and total information awareness, which, were, I think, a mistake. So I think in some ways we kind of have to rediscover our roots, get back to those strong privacy laws that protect citizens and protect consumers.
Do you see what the elements of what a sort of logical consensus policy would look like?
Well, I think so. And the really interesting thing about the internet and privacy is actually how much agreement you find as you move around the world and talk about privacy protection in the internet context. People sometimes say, oh, privacy is very culturally relative. Well, that's also true within a country, right? I mean, people say, well, you know, privacy in Europe looks like this, or privacy in the United States looks like that. But even within the United States, you know, privacy in a big city looks like this, privacy in a small town looks like that, privacy in different regions vary. But when you talk about the collection and use of personal data, you know, or its resale, or, you know, opt-in versus opt-out, I think people tend to reflect very similar values because they all have kind of a common understanding. You know, if I give a company some information for a particular purpose, like my home address so you can mail me that book I just ordered, that's fine, that's why I gave it to them. If they turn around and want to use it for some other purpose, you know, they should probably ask my permission. And I think if you asked people, you know, here in Raleigh, or if you asked them in, you know, in Tokyo or Rio, you know, or Budapest, I think they'd say roughly the same thing. I think it's actually almost common sense in some ways what privacy norms should be, and therefore what the laws might look like.
I don't know if you had heard about the Larry Lessig speech where he talked about the information 9/11. Richard Clark. Okay, well, the background on this is that Larry gave a speech. For sure, he gave it recently. I don't know if he's mentioned this before. About a month ago, and it really sort of picked up traction as a video online in the past 10 days or so. And part of it was talking about all the things that Larry talks about, and then he got to the sort of privacy, security, you know, sanctity of the internet portion of the speech. And he told about a conversation he had with Richard Clark after Clark had left government, in which Clark was talking about how after 9/11, very quickly after that, the Patriot Act was put in place. And the reason for that was that there was the contours of that law were already sitting in a drawer at the Justice Department and were sort of ready to go when and if they ever had to be implemented. Clark said that he was sure that there was essentially that same thing for an information 9/11, not necessarily a physical attack on the network, but that if an information catastrophe occurred, the Justice Department might be ready to go with a law on the book, or a proposed law that would involve a significant government intervention in seeing what was going on, trying to stem the damage, and stuff like that. Have you heard of anything like that?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned this. I actually debated Richard Clark a couple of months ago at the RSA conference, and it was on the topic of cyber war. I was on a panel with Richard and Michael Chertoff, who was the former Secretary of Homeland Security, and I actually expected that Secretary Chertoff would be the more formidable cyber warrior, but it turns out to be Richard Clark, and he's published a new book, I think, called Weapons of Mass Disruption, where he is really, you know, arguing that we've got to hit the bunkers and, you know, be prepared to engage for a full-scale cyber war. There are all sorts of risks, you know, in that view of the world. I mean, one of the comments I made about Richard's speech then was that, you know, privacy ends up being the collateral damage in cyber war, because in advance of, you know, mobilizing the attack or responding to an attack, we have, you know, surveillance, identification requirements, tracking. I remember a few years ago being invited to a workshop. John Poindexter had proposed eDNA. Every time you would go online, every electronic interaction you had would be hashed, which is, you know, uniquely linked to a digital representation of your DNA, so that basically every keystroke that you send across the internet could be traced back to you. And some of this stuff, I think, is just crazy. I mean, it's just, you know, it's completely nuts. I think, you know, we face real risks, you know, from other countries. We face risks in terms of corporate espionage. But I think we kind of have to be a little bit practical as well. I mean, one of the things that people know about the internet is basically designed to withstand nuclear attack. How do you create a decentralized communications network without a hub that can survive, you know, a very serious type of attack? So I think the network is actually pretty robust. Not to say that there aren't risks, but, you know, part of the risk is some of the changes we might make in anticipation of cyber war.
I want to ask this question before David has to leave, I know, but he was pointing out a really smart thing in a conversation after the last panel about the new terrain of concern about privacy in the mobile environment, particularly in the apps environment. There are no rules of the road about this. We're actually sort of still building the road in its most crude form, and there are plenty of ways now that apps are being built, perhaps without even direct reference to privacy. And I'm wondering what you, in your thinking about what a law ought to be or what the framework ought to be, how should that be taken account of?
Well, good privacy laws typically focus on the collection and use of personal data. And they say to companies, if you're going to collect and use personal data, you're going to take on some obligations. And this has actually two remarkable implications. One is that companies really have to think about how to protect the data they collect. They also need to think about whether it makes sense for them to collect so much data. I mean, you might think twice, for example, about gathering up people's social security numbers if you were facing some liability, if you had a security breach, for example, you got hacked. You won't particularly care if there's no risk of liability. But if there's a privacy law, you might think, well, maybe I can design this app without gathering so much information. In fact, maybe I can design this app in such a way that really doesn't require the user's actual identity at all, you know? And there are ways to do that. So I think this is actually an area where privacy law could really promote a lot of good innovation. Some of the most interesting work in the privacy field has been done, you know, by cryptographers who said, if you want to have private messages, you can encrypt, or if you want to have private payment systems, you can use blind signatures. There are lots of ways, I think, to develop new products that would pose much less of a risk to privacy. But you probably need a privacy law first to get that to happen.
Well, one of the sort of striking dimensions of this new world that was not necessarily very vividly present in the older world of online wired connections is geo-awareness. I mean, yes. You know, that apps are being built around that because of its connection to identity and social networks and obviously the commercial applications of it. How do you fit that into the framework?
You know, it's a funny question. When I came to the conference this morning and I really needed a coffee, and I couldn't, and I actually asked the security guy, I said, you know, where I get a coffee? He said, well, I think maybe somewhere down there, but he wasn't certain. And I had my iPhone with me, and I downloaded, you know, an app to find Starbucks, right? But I couldn't find, I don't know if anyone here knows where there's a Starbucks close by. Well, see, this would have been a whole lot more helpful because the app didn't work so well. But my thinking at the time was, you know, I mean, I have no problem with this because I want to, you know, get some information and presumably it's good for a local business that I'm trying to find and, you know, they're going to get my business as a result. I would have a completely different view of it, of course, if information about where I was being disclosed to others. And, you know, it's like being on the wrong side of a one-way.
Foursquare.
Yeah, well, but Foursquare is interesting too. I mean, I've talked, you know, I'm not using Foursquare. I'm not, you know, against using it, but I haven't tried it yet. I have talked to people who use Foursquare, and I think, you know, they're pretty sophisticated about it. They have some fun. I guess if you go to a place enough or if you reveal enough information, you become the mayor. Is that the cool thing?
One of the things, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm at a panel in Washington in some fancy federal courthouse with a bunch of lawyers, and one of the panelists is on Foursquare, and he's apparently become the mayor of the Federal District Courthouse of Washington, D.C. I thought, wow, that's kind of a cool trick. So, you know, I guess there are ways to do that. But like with many of these technologies, I think it's a mistake to say, oh, if you want to keep your privacy, you shouldn't use location-based services. I have almost the opposite view. In other words, I think, yeah, you should be able to use a location-based service. I should, you know, be able to find Starbucks, and other people are going to get some commercial benefit for that. And I'm not asking for charity on this. But I should also be able to protect my privacy. I don't see where the trade-off is. And again, I think, you know, innovative companies and thoughtful companies that pursue this strategy, I think, can do well. But they will also need the support, you know, of some privacy law and some advocacy that helps people understand. They shouldn't be constantly asked to make this trade-off.
Which is a perfect introduction of a question that I was thinking of as the other panel. I think it was Anne was describing how useful it would be for companies to consult those who care about privacy, right, as they were forming things, and you've got to be on the short list of that everybody generates for stuff like that. And I'd be interested in hearing about your encounters with the corporate world as they were thinking this through. At any number of levels. I mean, you must have had really good experiences with really good actors. You must have had medium experiences, and you must have had horrible experiences.
Well, it's a very funny question to ask me. I don't know if you know this about me, but I have a certain reputation in Washington and in the industry, and it's that we actually don't advise or consult with any business groups. We don't meet with them. You know, we don't review their proposals. We don't engage in any kind of interaction. And I can tell you some extraordinary stories. I mean, how far we've taken this principle. You know, we've turned down a lot of money from companies that have said, you know, we'd really appreciate your thoughts. Whatever you say, we're happy to hear. We were going after Microsoft in 2002 over Passport. We didn't like the fact that there was a universal sign-on system. And we're doing a lot of independent research and talking to a lot of experts. And I think AOL and Sun got word of what we were doing. They were very happy about it, by the way, because they were competing at the time against Microsoft. And they offered us all sorts of stuff. I mean, their technical assessment and expertise and support. We turned it all down. We said, no, thank you. Whatever we were going to say about Microsoft Passport was going to be based on our own research and not on theirs. And we've continued in that spirit pretty much since the start. And I think it actually scares people a little bit, you know, in Washington, because they're kind of accustomed to the idea that they can, you know, sort of work with you a bit. And I'll tell you one, you know, you asked for 3 kinds of stories. I had an experience early on which was actually pretty bad, and it led me quickly to the conclusion that this was the right way to do things. And I think, you know, Epic got started in the mid-1990s, mostly around the Clipper campaign and then against the FBI wiretap proposal, and then we got involved in consumer privacy issues. And some company came to us early on about a web-based product with some real privacy problems, and they, you know, wanted our views. And, you know, we hadn't thought much about whether or not we should meet with companies at the time, but we talked to them, and we said, well, you've got all sorts of problems here, which, you know, seemed pretty obvious. And then I heard the story later, apparently. They go off to meetings on Capitol Hill. And at that point, we already had a pretty good reputation for privacy. And they were asked, you know, by some members of Congress and their staff, well, you know, what do the privacy groups think? And they responded, well, we met with Epic, you know. And they said, oh, well, that's good. So you, I mean, by implication, so you've taken their concerns into account, and now your product is okay. So they, by implication, were okay with it too. And that was the reason we pretty much decided we couldn't do those meetings.
Nice, nice. There's a huge element of the stimulus program and down the road other encouragements coming out of the Obama administration towards electronic health records. How should we all be thinking about that in the context of being a special, most sanctified domain, or is it really something that if you apply sort of the basic tests that you were describing before, right, about collection, dissemination of information, is health stuff particularly precious, or is it mostly amply covered by other kinds of references to personal information?
Well, medical record information is huge in the privacy field, and I think it's, you know, huge for some reasons that are obvious and huge for some reasons that are not obvious. I mean, you know, there's always, I think, in the medical field, kind of a concern about the stigmatizing impact of some conditions, and, you know, people don't generally share with the public issues they might be dealing with, but it can also translate very concretely into employment opportunities and academic opportunities. You know, people, I think, for very good reason, present a resume that includes, you know, their accomplishments, their achievements, and their education, you know, not the last 4 diagnoses that their, you know, doctor provided. So the risks are real and the concerns are real, and of course there's also an effort now to move a lot of the information online, largely with the goal of trying to reduce costs, which will be interesting to see how that plays out. But of course when information moves online, it gets much easier for people to access. And I think that's one thing certainly that the internet has taught us. Now the president, I will say, last year passed as part of the High Tech Act comprehensive restrictions on the use of medical record information. I mean, the kind of privacy law we'd like to see actually mandates encryption, which is interesting, something that other countries have started to do with their own medical record systems. Basically says, if you're going to collect this sensitive data, you really have to encrypt. So what I think we're about to experience, is this radical movement toward a lot of information, a lot of very sensitive information going online in electronic formats, and at the same time a fairly powerful privacy law coming into play to try to counterbalance this and maybe reduce some of the risks. I don't know what the outcome's going to be. I mean, ideally, and if I'm right about not having to make trade-offs, we may have a wonderful new network providing electronic health services. We may reduce cost. We may improve delivery of health care and simultaneously manage the privacy risks. I think that's the outcome people are hoping for. But what happens, we'll see.
I should have asked the journalistic question while we were on the subject, but how do you see the law itself that you are describing, or the effort aimed at making a law, evolving? I mean, what kind of timeline are we working on? And what stage would you say that we are at now?
It's very hard to predict in Washington how laws get passed. And if you talk to people, I work for a fantastic senator, Senator Patrick Leahy, who's been in the Senate now, I think, for over 35 years. And you would ask him, how a law would be passed, and he would probably shake his head and say, I wish someone would tell me. Because, it can be very haphazard, and of course people can get very political. And political is good when it motivates people to try to get something done and act on a concern. Political is bad when people do things basically because they're trying to maintain their position and they don't really care about the outcomes. And in the legislative process, you get both. You get people who say, we really need some privacy law now because it's a problem. And you'll get people who say, we really don't want, the party in power to pass legislation because it will help them with re-election. And, I know you're familiar with that. But we'll see what happens. There's been a lot of talk about behavioral targeting, how data is collected on internet users used for advertising purposes. I testified yesterday in the Senate on children's online privacy. And I was actually pleased, Senate hearings are a pretty formal thing, and you go in, you put on your suit, and you nod your head a lot. Yes, Senator, no, Senator, that kind of thing. I was testifying before a subcommittee. A subcommittee was chaired by Senator Pryor, and we had a good exchange. But at the beginning of the hearing, Senator Rockefeller sits down at the committee table, at the, where the senators sit. And Senator Rockefeller is actually the chair of the full committee and one of the most senior members. And he said some very strong stuff in support of privacy. And I got done testifying, and one of my colleagues who said similar things, and he looked at us and he said, I agree with you, to me, and to my colleague, and I agree with you. And to the person next to me on the other side who said things very different, he shook his head and said, and I don't agree with you. And it was, it's kind of an exciting moment, I guess. And he's, in a good position to pass some law. So. And
is behavioral targeting sort of the object that's most directly in everybody's line of sight now?
Behavioral targeting is getting a lot of attention. The law that I was testifying on yesterday was the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is the law from the mid-1990s that basically deals with the collection of data for kids under 13. And I was arguing largely because of the emergence of social network services that we really needed protection for teenagers. And I said that the sort of self-regulatory approach based on privacy settings wasn't working. But I also said, listen, I think the social network services are great. I mean, the kids enjoy them. I don't think they should have to have a trade-off. But I do think we need some privacy safeguards. So you may see it for COPPA. You may see it for behavioral targeting. I think you'll see it also for security breaches, because people do need to know when their data is improperly disclosed, and I think the states have done a very good job in that area. There are other areas as well. DNA collection is very interesting. I don't know how many people have seen the movie Gattaca. It's actually one of my favorite movies. And part of what makes Gattaca so interesting is that futurist world is so seductive, right? I mean, it's a world of technological achievement, and you know, I mean, people look like Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman. You know, who wouldn't want to live in such a world, right? But of course, it comes at this enormous trade-off, because everyone's future is largely predetermined based on their DNA, and so you really have to confront questions, you know, of freedom and morality in a world where you have perfect information about people based on their data.
Well, in some respects, though, we are not from a biological perspective, but we are in the world of social media. We're heading into not necessarily that much awareness, but certainly much greater awareness of what our friends are doing, who they're interacting with, what they're thinking, what they're saying, what they like, what their music tastes are, and things like that. So in the life logging environment that we are now in, we're partly along that path, aren't we? And so I hear you saying that maybe Washington will cope with this in piecemeal fashion rather than sort of comprehensively.
Yeah, I know that comes as a big surprise to a lot of people. That although I mean, Washington does ever so often come up with comprehensive proposals. I don't mean to be too skeptical, but sometimes piecemeal is not bad either. But I will say on the social network sites, I think it's very important to distinguish what people choose to reveal to other people and what companies end up doing with the data that they collect. And my own feeling about services like Facebook is I think people, you know, basically should have the freedom to make their own choices about what to reveal to others. That's, you know, what freedom is about, and that's how we shape our own personalities. And, you know, people will make bad decisions, and they'll learn from them, and they'll make better decisions, and I don't have any problem with that. I mean, a lot of people, I think, you know, younger people post stuff online when they're going through school, and they post photos, and you know, then they begin to approach the job market, and stuff comes down. They clean things up a little bit, and you know, that's okay too. So I don't think we need a lot of regulation when it comes to how people interact with other people. But I do think when companies start to take that data and say, well, you know, now this person has revealed to her friend that she's really into this kind of music, or now this guy's, you know, telling his folks that he's, you know, thinking about going to Florida for vacation, and we can kind of pass that along backdoor, not directly to an advertiser maybe, but to a website or application developer, and there'll be some marketing that follows. I'm really uncomfortable with that. I think there are ways to do it that are above board and that are transparent and that involve opt-in, but that's not what's happening. People are revealing a lot of personal information to their friends, and that is being used, you know, very much backdoor for marketing.
Could you talk a little bit about the sort of politics of privacy? You know, if you came to the subject without necessarily knowing how Washington works, you would look at it and say there isn't a Republican version as distinct from a Democratic version, a liberal version as distinct from a conservative version. But you know, absent sort of the sort of politics for politics tactics that you were talking about before, how do you navigate in this environment, and how do you think about the coalitions that are possible and that are impossible? I mean, who your opponents are going to be?
Well, one of the really exciting things about privacy is I do think it's very much nonpartisan or bipartisan issue. Much of Washington is defined by the left and the right, and you know, there are agendas that are strongly associated, you know, with one political party or the other. But we find ourselves in the privacy world, you know, moving back and forth across the political spectrum on a whole range of issues. In fact, today we had a privacy coalition meeting with about 40 organizations. We've got, you know, traditional progressive groups, we've got traditional conservative groups, we have libertarian groups, and I think that's a wonderful thing about the issue. Now, of course, you ask the question, who's on the other side, and invariably it's, you know, whoever we're trying to regulate or hold accountable, which you can't always predict. You know, it may be the TSA, for example, because we don't like the body scanners going into the airports. We don't think they work. We think they're intrusive. We think they're very expensive. We think there are better ways to deal with the challenge of airport security. And so we'll go after the TSA pretty aggressively with a lot of our friends, and we'll write to Secretary Napolitano and ask her to essentially end that program. Well, I don't think we're going to get invited to their Christmas party this year. I just, I'm not going to wait for that invitation. But, Google and Facebook, I mean, for us increasingly we focus on, not because their competitors have asked us to focus on them, but because they engage in the kinds of practices that we think are raising the greatest privacy concerns for users. So we almost, naturally, if we're doing our job, we have to stay focused on them. Both companies are pretty clever in Washington. I mean, they've got, consumer groups that work with them and say, well, maybe it's not quite so bad what they're doing. And now we find ourselves in opposition to groups that are supposed to represent consumers, but they end up representing the companies when these debates begin, which has always seemed to me a little odd. But in some respects, it's kind of an exciting thing, too, because you see these organizations come together, and next week, for example, we'll probably do something with Facebook, and there's a lot of discussion. How do we talk about the privacy concerns with the new settings? How do we feel about instant personalization? It's really good what comes out of it, I think.
You probably wake up lots of mornings and hear about news in one way, shape, or form and think, I know what I'm going to do today, and I know what bad action has taken place by an actor that I know how to go after. But you must wake up some mornings and think, oh my gosh, the users that I am trying to champion in their interest, they do such stupid things. They don't behave in their best interest. They don't behave in ways that necessarily line up with their values. Are there things that users do that make it really hard for you to argue the things that you argue for?
Well, I mean, it's a very reasonable question, but again, I think people should have the right to do stupid things. Within reason. I have to be careful, too, because I have 2 teenagers, so if this ends up online, I'm just kidding, guys. What I just said doesn't apply to you directly. You don't get to do stupid things. But as I said, I mean, I think people do learn from mistakes, and I think to try to, and this is particularly true in the online world, I mean, you'll post a photo from one party and kind of figure out afterwards maybe that wasn't such a smart thing to do, and you won't do it again. Now, someone can tell you, well, you got to be a little careful what you post from parties, but it's not quite the same thing as actually having experienced it, right? So it isn't such a bad thing, I think, to be able to do some stupid things. But what concerns me, again, is when people really can't control these decisions. Because companies have taken away from them those abilities. I mean, the changes in the Facebook privacy settings I thought was a really big deal. I mean, here were users who had said, okay, this stuff I'll make available to everyone, this stuff I'll make available to friends, this stuff I'll make available to friends of friends, and I'll take all the time to do all of that. It does take time, by the way, to go through these privacy settings, particularly when they tend to default in ways you don't want them to default to, and you sort of have to think for a moment, well, hold it, I don't want that setting to be that way. You really have to work at it. So users go through that, and they set up their settings, and then the company comes along and says, well, we're kind of going to change things around a little bit. We've got a joke, at Epic. I mean, you can imagine the way a lot of these settings work. You slide them to the off position, then you see it kind of go back to the on position, and you slide it to the off, and it stays there, and you turn around to work on something else, and you go and move back. And you have this sense about privacy settings. It's almost magnetic. They seem to be drawn to the position that has your data being disclosed. And that's the kind of stuff that we'll focus on.
Yeah, nice. I don't want to monopolize this whole conversation. There might be questions, and we'll just shout them out from there.
Sure. I wanted to go back to your general category of politics of privacy. Again, whether or not you agree or disagree with this individual position, I was kind of troubled when Joe the Plumber's private information started coming out.
Right.
Whether or not you agree with what he asked President Obama, that really sent shockwaves to me as a private citizen choosing to engage in a public forum, open discussion. I legitimately had a question. The legitimate issue, and suddenly we find out about his marriage, his mortgage, his checking account. I thought that was totally out of bounds, and I don't think the media got held to account for that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. You know, I've been teaching privacy law for a long time, and the first week of my class I teach this famous article that was written in 1890 by Brandeis and Warren on the right to privacy, and they basically set out, you know, in this one article, the entire theory, or much of the theory of the modern right to privacy, which of course drives academics in the privacy field crazy because they write dozens of articles and never get as much attention as this one 19th century article did. But the reason I'm telling you this story is because they describe how it is that people should have some control of their personal identity, and then having described it, they begin to talk about the exceptions. And the first exception is the public's right to know, right? So we think a lot about privacy, but then we think, well, the public has the right to know. And then they say, well, shouldn't we distinguish between public figures who may say, you know, leading a moral life is very important, and then it turns out, in fact, that they do all sorts of things that aren't immoral. Doesn't the public have the right to know that kind of information about a public figure, whereas a private person who doesn't hold himself out in this way, doesn't make such pronouncements, really shouldn't be subject by the press to such scrutiny? And the remarkable thing about this way of thinking about, you know, a person's private life is that for the most part, courts have tended to follow this. You know, they've tended to say, if you are a public person and you tend to talk a lot about, you know, these kinds of issues, I think we would reasonably understand why you might, you know, be pressed a little bit as to your private life. But for most other people, I think it's probably not appropriate. So coming back to Joe the plumber, I don't know exactly where to put him on that spectrum. I mean, I think he certainly put himself out there on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it was a little, you know, probably too aggressive and too political. Maybe it's just an attempt to embarrass him, which, you know, I don't think was a particularly, you know, good thing. So I wouldn't defend that.
It raises for me the question of citizen engagement. I mean, if people see that's how the treatment is going to be,
right?
How do we have civil dialogue and civil conversation when something that you may say and another party disagrees, your private life will now be under attack?
Well, yes, and on that point, and I mentioned this during our last session, we participated. It was a very unpopular decision that we made. I can tell you this, and I think it was very unpopular. We sided with the groups from Washington State that had opposed the gay marriage law and pursued a referendum initiative, basically trying to block gay marriage, and circulated a petition. And they wanted their identities kept secret in the petition, their signatures kept secret, because they were concerned about retribution for their political activity. I think maybe this is your point. And we agreed with them, actually. We said that part of participating in political life actually requires being able to withhold your identity if you're going to express unpopular, controversial views. Now, there are people on the other side of that who argued with us and said, well, you know, people should be accountable for the views they express. There's certainly something to that. But it's interesting, if you think about the way we do voting in the United States, for example, we've always had a secret ballot, right? And people can go and cast their vote for whoever they want, and no one will know who they voted for. So in an interesting way, I think privacy actually can promote political engagement.
Right, and again, if he had been a public figure, you know, again, when you look at libel and slander cases, you know, you have all the various tests of
right.
public versus private, but I think those lines are still a little blurry.
Well, and even in my memory of the Joe the Plumber thing, it wasn't just a sort of a media initiative that brought this information out. A lot of it was crowdsourced. People right. seeing that he had said these things, as Obama supporters or just people that wanted to make his life miserable, surfaced the information that then was publicly reported by the broadcast media. But it was in many senses now that the boundary between well, there is no boundary. People can find this stuff out, that the sense of being a public person or not is very different in an environment where everybody has the capacity to be an activist or a publisher or whatever. And is there a way in which to think about the legal responsibilities of all kinds of creators, not just corporate creators or corporate collectors in this environment?
Yeah, well, it's not easy. I mean, it's, you know, it's certainly a very different world, and things get said about people, you know, particularly among kids. I mean, it's a little disheartening, I guess. There's quite a lot of online bullying, right? And you can say things, and it gets around very quickly, and it's essentially impossible to undo. I think people have kind of learned to tolerate it, although in some cases, and I think with some kids, it's just gone too far. So we do need to be a little bit careful about how we communicate with one another online. People who run for public office generally have pretty thick skins. If they don't at the beginning, they do by the time of the end. So maybe they're more accustomed to that.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
I think the government already has a way of dealing with its secrets, and there are lots of laws regarding classification of information, especially the military. Is there anything we could do to kind of maybe give individuals those kinds of rights, like classify your own information?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, a lot of times when I'm talking about privacy, I almost purposefully don't use the word secrecy because I associate secrecy with government. And I'm actually not a big fan of government secrecy. I think governments should generally be transparent and accountable. And when they are being secretive, I think there's usually some reason for concern, or at least asking what is going on that they can't talk about, or who's in a position to know if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Obviously, there are circumstances where governments need secrecy. But privacy, of course, is very different. I mean, privacy is really about the rights of individuals. And you know, we've certainly pushed a lot for privacy laws to protect individuals, and simultaneously pushed against secrecy laws that make government opaque. And then you get into these very interesting situations. I mentioned the body scanners, which we are really, really trying to stop. I mean, we don't, you know, I tell people when I'm talking about privacy, it's not just a concern or worry. We actually take positions and we want an outcome. And our current campaign is to stop the deployment of the body scanners in U.S. airports. We obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request the technical specifications of the devices, right? I mean, these are devices that, you know, almost everybody may be expected to go through at some point and provide an almost complete graphic image of you undressed. And we learned very, you know, some very interesting things. I mean, one, for example, is that this device, which wasn't supposed to store and record images, has a requirement, and built in is the ability to store and record images. It has various privacy settings, which seems a little creepy to me. I don't know exactly what the low privacy setting is compared with a high privacy setting. And you know, of course, who gets to change the settings. It's the super user, if you look in the access control. So that was interesting, too. But here's the most interesting part of the story. You've heard a lot about the body scanners because of the December 25th incident in the plane heading to Detroit and the guy with the powdered explosives. The original contracts for the body scanners were developed in 2006. And in 2006, the technical specifications listed weapons, explosives, and liquids, but not powders, among the items that should be targeted by the device. In other words, in our view, this device, which strips people naked, the airport, wasn't even designed to identify the material that was used on December 25th that now is the basis for arguing they should be in all the airports. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes the individual interest in privacy and the need for government openness is actually much more tightly integrated than you realize. A lot of these systems that involve, you know, tracking and surveillance and monitoring really need to be inspected carefully to understand how they operate, will they be effective, what's their cost? And I think what you'll find is if you diminish government secrecy, you'll actually enhance personal privacy.
Do you think that the same degree of privacy for individuals online should also adhere to privately held companies and their actions online?
No. I mean, look, I think, you know, just like governments sometimes have a need for secrecy, you know, companies sometimes have a need to protect trade secrets and proprietary information. I'm not saying that there aren't circumstances where companies should have some privacy. Well, I'm trying not to use that word. But I do think privacy for individuals is basically a fundamental right. You know, it's like freedom of speech, for example. And I think we really need to treat it differently. Companies, when they go online, you know, are offering products and services to consumers or providing information. I think that's obviously a good thing, you know, something that the internet has made possible for a lot more people than in the past. But I think it's also important to know, particularly with respect to their data collection practices, how do they use the information that they collect about people? I mean, this is, you know, part of our objection with Facebook is that it's actually very hard for users to control the way Facebook transfers their data to their business partners. I'm not saying that they shouldn't or that they couldn't, but I am saying that users should have more information about how that happens. And so that would be less secretive, I think, or could be less secretive.
Any other questions? I'll ask the final one then. Maybe I should have started here, but this is a subject around which you are internationally eminent, and obviously you care a lot about it. And I'm interested in your journey to it. How did it get to be that this was the subject that you took up as your life's work?
Yeah. Well, I actually had a great experience in between college and law school. I found myself in the early 1980s in Washington, D.C., with an interest in civil liberties and also the ability to set up personal computers, which were then becoming available probably before a lot of you guys were born, but that's okay. I don't know if people were particularly interested in my interest in civil liberties, but I certainly got to meet a lot of people and set up computers and you know, printers, and started to think more and more about the implications of new technology and its impact on privacy. And I guess I came to two conclusions. I mean, one was that privacy was going to be very important as people became more dependent on computers, but also that it would be really important to understand how the technology was used, to be, you know, an active participant. Because I think up to that time, a lot of people who cared strongly about privacy really stood at a distance, and they said, well, you know, if you're concerned about privacy, maybe you shouldn't use a computer. Just like people today say to me, oh, you're concerned about privacy, why are you on Facebook? And I said, well, because that's where people are, and I want to talk with them about privacy. So that's kind of where I started, and that's, I guess, still where I am.
Nice. Well, did you have another question? Okay.
Actually, yeah.
Sure.
I was just curious to see what you think the future implications will be if the standards for privacy in the Western hemisphere, in Western cultures, became drastically different from what was considered to be digital privacy in the East, and kind of if those two split apart as the internet kind of mingled recently.
Well, I really do think there's convergence. I think the United States has been a little bit alone in the internet privacy world, basically because it's resisted regulation. That's the key divide today. Most of the world does, in fact, have some kind of privacy law in place. Now, you can argue about the effectiveness of those laws, but the U.S. has generally favored a self-regulatory approach. It's, you know, it's possible. I mean, I could imagine a couple of years from now a real showdown between the United States and Europe. Google Street View, for example, has really set off some very sharp debate among a lot of the European countries because, particularly in Europe, it seems obvious that a company does not have the right to go down the street and take, images of your house or you standing in front of your house without your permission. They're saying that this activity really needs to stop. In the U.S., it's been less of a concern. So we may see some battles over that. I don't know. But I think, as I said at the beginning, that the challenges we're facing look so similar. Whether you're here or in Europe or in Asia or really anywhere else, I think the likelihood that we'll find some common approaches is pretty high.
It looks like Epic does a great job kind of keeping readers informed of like new events and new changes. Do you or are you aware of other sites that maybe have like best practices or tips to help you maintain your privacy or your liberties?
We used to have a really excellent page. I mean, we still have it, but I don't think it's as current as it needs to be, called Practical Privacy Tools. And we basically posted, without endorsement, all the best privacy tools we could find. And I've seen other people do similar things. So, and you can do searches now. I mean, you can look for practical privacy tools or privacy tips. But I will warn you a little bit, because we get this call a lot from news organizations. They say, oh, we're going to do a piece tonight on the evening news on what consumers can do to protect their privacy, and we'd like to get you, come on and give us some tips. And the problem, of course, is that a lot of the business practices are changing so quickly. It's not that easy for consumers, even consumers who are very dedicated, to protect their privacy. So increasingly we're saying, we really see this as less about educating the driver and more about getting the manufacturer to build safer cars, to provide products and services that do a better job protecting privacy. From our perspective, that's really what needs to happen at this point. I mean, I could tell you, go onto Facebook and check your settings, and this is what you should do if you care about privacy, and then next week, Facebook can say we've changed things again. So that will be a problem.
Well, maybe that will be the last word. Thank you for this time,
Sure.
but more importantly, thank you for your work.
Thank you, Lee. Nice speaking with you.